In a quiet little neighborhood, everyone knew each other. The houses were neat, the lawns were green, and the streets were peaceful. Life seemed simple, calm, and friendly. But for one person, life in this peaceful neighborhood was about to take a strange and frustrating turn. He was proud of his small house, especially the garden in front. He had spent months planting a beautiful hedge along the edge of his yard. Every morning, he would wake up early, water the plants, and make sure everything looked perfect. The hedge was his pride, a little piece of nature that he nurtured with care. It was more than just plants, it was his little project, his escape from the stress of everyday life. But not everyone appreciated the care he put into his garden. Across the street lived Karen, a woman known for her sharp tongue and her strict rules about everything in the neighborhood. At first, he thought she was just a normal neighbor, someone a little too particular about noise or parking. But soon, it became clear that Karen had a very different kind of interest. She liked to interfere in other people's lives. It started slowly. One morning, he woke up to find a small part of his hedge bent over. Maybe the wind did it, he thought. He fixed it, watered the plants, and tried to forget about it. But the next day, it happened again. And then again. It wasn't the weather. It was Karen. She had been walking past his yard every morning, muttering to herself, and sometimes leaning over to break the small branches of his carefully trimmed hedge. At first, he didn't want to believe it. She couldn't be doing this on purpose, he told himself. But the evidence was impossible to ignore. Every day, part of his hedge was destroyed. He tried talking to her. "Karen, please, could you not touch my plants?" he asked politely one afternoon. She just looked at him, smiled in a way that made his stomach sink, and walked away. No apology, no acknowledgement. Nothing. Days turned into weeks, and the situation became worse. Karen started arriving earlier in the mornings, and every day, there was more damage. It was almost like she was enjoying it. She had a way of making his life miserable without even saying a word. He started documenting everything. Every broken branch, every crushed leaf, he took photos. He even set up a small camera in his yard to see what she was doing. And the footage was clear. Karen was deliberately walking into his yard, stepping over the small fence, and destroying his hedge. Watching her on the camera, he felt a mix of anger and disbelief. How could someone be so cruel over something so small? It was just a hedge, just a piece of a yard. But it was his. And she had no respect for it. At first, he tried to ignore it. He thought if he stayed calm, maybe Karen would stop. But she didn't. In fact, her behavior became more aggressive. She would leave pieces of trash in his garden, knock over his decorations, and sometimes even stand there smirking as he cleaned up. One morning, after fixing the hedge for the third time that week, he sat down on his porch and just stared at it. Enough is enough, he thought. I can't let this continue. But he didn't want to react angrily. He didn't want to just yell at her or call the police. No, he wanted something smarter. Something that would finally make her realize that messing with him had consequences. He wanted a plan. A plan that would make Karen regret ever touching his hedge. As the days went by, he started thinking more seriously. He thought about what she had done and what she deserved. Every time he saw her walking past, smiling like she had won some secret victory, he felt a small spark of determination. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Karen was clever, tricky, and stubborn. But he was patient. And patience was part of the plan. At the same time, he kept his calm exterior in front of everyone else. Neighbors would ask him, "How's your garden?" and he would smile, pretending that everything was fine. Inside, though, he was building a strategy. Every branch she broke, every plant she bent, every smile she gave while ruining his hedge only fueled his determination. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice, about finally taking control of a situation that had been driving him crazy. And he had something in mind, a plan worth $27,000. It wasn't a small plan, and it wasn't something that could be done quickly. But he knew it would work. And he knew that Karen would never see it coming. The suspense built as he started preparing. He would watch her daily routines, take notes, and plan every small detail. From the way she parked her car to the hours she spent in her yard, everything mattered. He wasn't going to leave anything to chance. And then came the moment that made him realize the plan had to start soon. One morning, he noticed her leaning over the hedge, her hands crushing the top branches like she had done 100 times before. But this time, something inside him snapped. He looked at her, smiled calmly, and whispered to himself, "This ends now." It wasn't anger that drove him, it was focus. A quiet, controlled focus that promised that Karen would finally understand the consequences of her actions. As the sun set that evening, he sat on his porch, looking at the hedge. It had been repaired, of course, but it didn't feel the same. The peace of the neighborhood was gone, replaced by a tense anticipation. He knew that the coming days would change everything. And in that quiet moment, he realized something important: Karen had underestimated him. She thought he was just a regular neighbor, someone who would sit back and take the abuse. But she was wrong. Very wrong. The story was just beginning, and soon, the quiet streets of the neighborhood would witness something they would never forget. Something that involved patience, planning, and a $27,000 plan that would shock everyone. For now, though, all he could do was wait, watch, and prepare. Karen had started the war when she destroyed his hedge. And he was going to finish it in a way she would never forget. Little did Karen know, her daily destruction of the hedge was about to cost her far more than she could imagine. The sun had barely risen when he noticed it. Another morning, another mess. The hedge, his pride and joy, was ruined again. The branches were bent, some snapped completely. Tiny pieces of leaves littered the ground like confetti after a cruel parade. He rubbed his eyes in disbelief. How could this happen every single day? It had become a pattern. Karen would appear every morning, almost like clockwork, walking past his yard with a calm, almost smug expression. It was as if she enjoyed watching him clean up, as if his frustration was some kind of entertainment. He tried everything. He repaired the hedge with extra care, trimmed the broken branches, and even reinforced the weaker spots. But no matter what he did, by the next morning, it was destroyed again. Each time, his anger grew. Not the kind of sudden rage that makes you shout, but a slow, simmering frustration that burrowed deep inside him. One day, he decided to confront Karen once again. He stepped outside, taking a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Karen, please. I've fixed the hedge so many times. Can you just leave it alone?" Karen stopped, looked at him, and smiled. Not a friendly smile. Not a polite smile. A smile that said, "I know exactly what I'm doing, and you can't stop me." Then she walked away. That smile stayed in his mind all day, burning like a brand. It wasn't just the hedge. Karen started leaving little messages of her presence everywhere. A garden gnome knocked over, a trash can slightly tipped, footprints across his lawn. It was subtle, but he noticed. And it was deliberate. He began documenting everything more seriously. Camera footage, daily notes, timestamps. Every broken branch, every small act of destruction, every smirk she made when she passed, it was all recorded. He felt like a detective investigating a crime scene. And in many ways, it was a crime, at least in the court of common sense. Neighbors started noticing his frustration too. "Your hedge looks amazing, but I keep seeing damage every morning," one neighbor mentioned casually. He smiled politely, nodded, and said nothing. How could he explain what was happening without sounding like he was overreacting? Karen had a reputation for being unreasonable, and anyone who complained about her was usually dismissed. The hedge became more than just a garden, it became a symbol. A symbol of patience, frustration, and determination. Every day he worked on it, he felt like he was fighting a silent war. Karen had started it, and now, it was up to him to finish it, but he needed a plan. At night, he would sit on his porch, staring at the hedge under the dim glow of the streetlight. His mind replayed the day's events. He imagined Karen walking past, smiling as she crushed the branches. And he imagined the perfect response, calm, clever, and decisive. He didn't want revenge that was messy or impulsive, He wanted a response that would make her rethink ever crossing him again. He began thinking strategically. How did she move? What times did she act? What patterns could he predict? Every tiny detail mattered. Her car parked in the same spot every morning, the way she sipped coffee while staring at his yard, even the times she chatted with other neighbors before striking. It was all a map of her behavior, and he memorized it. The frustration, however, didn't only affect him mentally. It started affecting his sleep, his mornings, and even the way he interacted with other neighbors. He would arrive early, fix the hedge, and leave quickly. Lunch breaks became moments to strategize instead of relax. Every day felt like a test of patience and endurance. Then came the morning that almost broke him. He woke up to see half the hedge crushed completely, like a tiny storm had passed through it. But there was no storm. No wind, no animals. Just Karen. She had left her signature mark, the crooked branches, the footprints, the smirk he could almost see in his mind. That was the turning point. He realized that ignoring her, being polite, or just repairing the damage wasn't enough. Karen wasn't going to stop on her own. And the more he tried to be patient, the bolder she became. It wasn't just frustration anymore. It was determination. He wanted her to feel the consequences, to understand that her actions had weight. But he also knew he couldn't rush it. Karen was clever, and any direct confrontation would just make her defensive. He needed a plan, something calculated, something that would finally stop her. While he planned, he also started small experiments, tiny traps, harmless deterrents, and tests to see if she would react. He didn't want to escalate too soon, he wanted her to reveal herself fully. Every day he learned more about her habits, her routines, her weaknesses. It was a slow game, but he was patient. He had to be. The hedge became more than a plant. It became a symbol of his fight against a relentless neighbor. Each snapped branch reminded him of Karen's cruelty, but also of the clever response that would come. Each morning, he repaired it, documenting her actions, and building the foundation for what would eventually become a $27,000 plan, a plan that would change everything. By the end of the week, he noticed a shift in himself. He no longer felt helpless or angry in a wild, chaotic way. Instead, he felt focused. Calm. Strategic. Karen had started the battle, but he was preparing the war. The day ended quietly. He watered the hedge one last time, straightened the bent branches, and stepped back to admire his work. The street was silent. The neighborhood looked calm, peaceful. But inside, he knew the tension was growing. Karen's daily destruction had created something unexpected, a new version of himself. Patient, focused, and ready. And as he closed the gate and turned toward his house, he whispered to himself, "Soon, Karen will understand. She'll know what it means to mess with me." The hedge stood in the dim evening light, a symbol of resilience, of patience, and of a plan slowly taking shape. Karen had made a mistake, and he was ready to make sure she would regret it. Little did Karen know, every day she destroyed that hedge was bringing her closer to a surprise she would never see coming. It was late at night when he realized something important. Karen wasn't just careless or mean, she was predictable. Every movement, every routine, every little habit could be studied. And if he studied her carefully, he could turn her own predictability against her. He sat at his desk, surrounded by photos, notes, and a small camera he had hidden in the hedge. On the screen, Karen walked past the yard again, smirking as she crushed the branches. The footage replayed in slow motion. Every step, every glance, every little action was recorded. And now, he could finally analyze it. He began mapping her days. Morning coffee? At 7:15. Walk past his yard? Always at 7:30. Small talk with neighbors? 7:40, checking her mailbox? 7:50, it was like a puzzle, and every piece fit perfectly into a pattern. For the first time, he felt a real sense of control. Karen had unknowingly revealed her own routine to him, and he intended to use it. He wasn't reacting blindly anymore, he was planning, calculating, and preparing. The plan, however, had to be careful. Impulsive actions would alert her. Mistakes would ruin everything. He needed to be patient, precise, and clever. He pulled out a notebook and began writing everything down: times, places, patterns, possible weak points. Every detail mattered. Next, he thought about her strengths and weaknesses. Karen was confident, almost arrogant, which was good for him. She never looked over her shoulder, never expected anyone to challenge her. That overconfidence was his advantage. If he could bait her into a predictable trap, she would fall for it without even realizing. He also considered the hedge itself. It was still fragile, still easily destroyed. But it could be part of the plan. Every crushed branch, every bent leaf, every small act of destruction could be recorded as evidence or used to manipulate the situation in his favor. The hedge became both a target and a tool. Days turned into weeks, and the investigation consumed him. Every morning, he would observe from his porch or peek through the small camera. Every evening, he would replay footage and update his notes. He became like a detective, but with a personal mission. And with every passing day, his plan became more detailed, more sophisticated. He also started thinking about the ultimate goal. $27,000. That number wasn't random, it represented not just money, but the scale of the plan he wanted to execute. It had to be big enough to make a statement, smart enough to avoid immediate suspicion, and clever enough to leave a lasting impression. Meanwhile, he continued to maintain appearances in the neighborhood. To everyone else, he was the calm, quiet neighbor, fixing his hedge every morning, smiling politely at passers-by. But inside, his mind was racing with calculations, contingencies, and strategies. Karen had no idea that her arrogance and predictable behavior were giving him the advantage. He also anticipated potential problems. What if she noticed the cameras? What if she tried to sabotage his plan? Every scenario was considered and countered in his mind. Every step was carefully thought out, every move calculated. This wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about strategy, patience, and precision. Then came the breakthrough. By studying her routine, he realized there was one critical moment, one small window of opportunity where Karen would be completely exposed and unsuspecting. That moment became the centerpiece of his plan. It wasn't just about reacting to her actions anymore, it was about using her own habits against her. He began preparing small tools, harmless distractions, and minor tests to see how she would react. He experimented without revealing anything, carefully observing her responses. Each reaction gave him more insight into her personality, her weaknesses, and her predictability. Every day, the tension grew. Karen continued her daily destruction, unaware that her actions were feeding his plan. And he felt a growing sense of satisfaction. Not the satisfaction of immediate revenge, but the satisfaction of being in control, of knowing that he could outsmart her completely. He even started visualizing the final outcome. Karen's smug smile replaced by shock, disbelief, and perhaps a hint of regret. The hedge would no longer be a symbol of her destruction, but of his patience and ingenuity. And the $27,000 plan would be the final, decisive blow, proving that clever strategy always triumphs over arrogance. The nights grew longer, the planning more detailed. He studied maps, observed traffic patterns, and even calculated timings to the minute. Karen had unknowingly created the perfect blueprint for his revenge. Every step she took, every predictable action, was part of the puzzle, and he was ready to solve it. By the time the week ended, he had everything in place. The hedge was repaired, the cameras were hidden, and the final plan was taking shape. All he needed now was the right moment, the perfect opportunity when Karen's arrogance and routine would give him the upper hand. And he knew it was coming. Karen would act, as she always did. She would be predictable. And when that moment arrived, the payoff would be complete. For now, he waited, patient and calm, like a hunter observing the forest. Karen's daily destruction had been a nuisance, yes, but it had also been a gift. It had revealed her habits, her weaknesses, and her predictability. And he intended to use every bit of that knowledge to execute a plan that she would never see coming. The story was moving from frustration to strategy. The war was no longer about the hedge, it was about patience, intelligence, and the perfect execution. Karen had unknowingly written her own fate, and he was ready to read it. The quiet streets of the neighborhood seemed peaceful, but beneath the calm surface, a silent battle of wits was taking shape. And when the moment finally came, Karen would discover just how dangerous it could be to underestimate someone who was patient, clever, and determined. The morning air was unusually crisp, almost as if the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. He stepped out, carrying a small box with carefully prepared tools. Today wasn't just another day of repairing the hedge, it was the day his plan began. Every move had been calculated, every step timed perfectly. He paused for a moment, looking at the hedge. It seemed ordinary to anyone else, just green leaves glistening in the morning sun. But to him, it was the centerpiece of a carefully orchestrated trap. Every branch, every camera, every hidden detail had a purpose. Karen didn't suspect a thing. And that was exactly how it had to be. For weeks, he had observed her, studied her habits, and mapped every routine. Now, all that preparation would come into play. He checked the hidden camera one last time. Karen's car wasn't in sight yet, and she wouldn't appear for another 30 minutes. Perfect. Timing was everything. He arranged small decoys and minor distractions around the yard, subtle enough not to raise suspicion, but precise enough to guide Karen's movements exactly where he wanted them. Each placement was deliberate: a slightly tilted garden gnome, a strategically placed leaf pile, a quiet creaking sound that would draw her attention at the right moment. This wasn't just a trap. It was a symphony of small details, all designed to manipulate her predictable behavior. And the thought of it made him smile. Karen had always thought she was clever, untouchable, immune to consequences. Soon, she would learn how wrong she was. As he adjusted the last detail, he imagined her walking down the path, smirking at the hedge as she always did. That smirk would be the signal, the moment where everything fell into place. He had rehearsed it in his mind countless times: her steps, her glance, the exact moment she would interact with the trap. He also prepared a backup plan. Patience was key. If anything went wrong, he needed a way to keep the trap intact without alerting her. Every step was layered with contingencies. Nothing was left to chance. Then, he heard the familiar sound of her car pulling into the street. Karen had arrived. His pulse quickened, not out of fear, but anticipation. This was the moment he had been waiting for. He moved quietly to his hidden vantage point, camera ready, heart steady. Karen stepped out of her car, carrying her morning coffee, completely unaware of the small devices and decoys waiting to guide her. She adjusted her sunglasses, smiled faintly to herself, and started walking toward the hedge. Exactly as predicted. He held his breath as she approached. Every action she took confirmed his calculations. She leaned slightly toward the hedge, bending over to inspect the branches, unaware that her own routine was leading her straight into the trap. He had designed the setup to take advantage of her habits, to use her arrogance against her. Each decoy subtly pushed her movement, guiding her without her noticing. It was a delicate balance between invisible manipulation and precise timing. From his hidden position, he observed carefully. This was more than revenge, it was proof of patience, strategy, and meticulous planning. Every crushed branch, every smirk she had ever given, had led to this moment. And soon, she would feel the weight of it. Minutes felt like hours. Karen's attention wavered slightly, a tiny hesitation that he had predicted. But it didn't matter, the trap was working perfectly. She moved right into position, her actions unknowingly setting the stage for the final execution. He couldn't help but admire the elegance of the plan. It was subtle, precise, and completely foolproof. If she stayed predictable, she wouldn't escape the consequences. And the best part? She had no idea that all her daily destruction, all her arrogance, had prepared the way for this. Then came the crucial moment. Karen, fully immersed in her routine, took the exact step he had been waiting for. Everything aligned perfectly: the decoys, the distractions, the hidden camera. The trap was set, and the final phase was about to begin. He whispered quietly to himself, a grin spreading across his face. This is it. The moment she realizes she isn't untouchable. The moment she learns the cost of messing with me. Even as Karen bent over the hedge, completely unaware, the tension was almost unbearable. Every second felt electric. The quiet street seemed to amplify the suspense, the calm before the storm. And he knew that when the trap sprung, there would be no turning back. All that preparation, all that observation, all that patience, it had led to this precise moment. Karen's arrogance and predictable behavior had finally become her weakness. And soon, she would learn exactly how dangerous it was to underestimate someone who was determined, clever, and patient. The scene held for a moment, almost like time had stopped. And then, with one small, perfectly timed action, the trap began to work. Karen had unknowingly triggered the first stage of a plan she would never forget, a plan that would change everything in her world. He watched, calm and focused, knowing that every crushed branch, every smirk she had given over the past weeks, had led to this exact moment. The execution phase had begun, and the stakes had never been higher. This was no longer about a hedge. This was about strategy, patience, and the ultimate payoff. Karen had started the war, but he was about to end it with precision, planning, and a $27,000 lesson she would never forget. The morning sun had barely touched the rooftops when he noticed it. Karen was moving faster than usual. Something in her step, a slight nervousness in her shoulders, told him she was about to do exactly what he had predicted, but she didn't realize it yet. He was already in position, hidden behind the porch, heart steady, eyes sharp. Every tool, every small setup, every calculated detail was ready. For weeks, he had waited for this moment. Every crushed branch, every smirk, every tiny act of destruction had been a breadcrumb leading him to this day. Karen approached the hedge, coffee in hand, sunglasses shielding her eyes, completely unaware of what was coming. She bent slightly to inspect the branches, leaning exactly where he had anticipated. His finger hovered near the trigger of the first step in the trap, a small, harmless mechanism he had set up to startle her and guide her movements precisely where he wanted. He watched closely as her predictable routine unfolded like clockwork. Each step, each glance, each careless movement was exactly as he had planned. The tension in the air was almost tangible. It felt as if the neighborhood itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable collision of plan and reality. And then it began. A subtle sound, a tiny creak, a slight movement of the ground, caught her attention. Karen paused, looking around cautiously. But it was too late. She had already stepped exactly where he wanted her to. The trap had begun to work. His heart raced, but his hands remained calm. Every reaction she made confirmed his calculations. She stumbled slightly over the first obstacle, a minor distraction he had placed, and instinctively corrected herself. Perfect. That minor adjustment led her to the next stage, guiding her into the exact position for the final execution. From his hidden spot, he watched her carefully, noting every micro-movement. Karen's confidence wavered for the first time in weeks. Her arrogance was faltering. She had no idea that her own habits, her predictability, and her daily destruction of the hedge had led her directly into this precise setup. He could almost hear her thoughts as she straightened herself, adjusting her sunglasses, wondering why everything suddenly felt off. But he didn't interfere. Patience was crucial. He had waited too long to rush anything now. Every second mattered. The next stage was critical. He triggered a small, harmless alert, a sound that drew her just enough to step into the exact spot he had prepared. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone watching from the street, but perfect for his plan. She moved precisely as intended, each step reinforcing the chain reaction he had so carefully designed. Karen's movements were now completely guided by the setup he had spent weeks perfecting. She had unknowingly sealed her own fate. His plan was elegant in its simplicity, yet devastating in its effectiveness. Every small detail he had anticipated worked flawlessly, the timing, the distractions, her predictable habits, and her own overconfidence. And then came the moment he had been waiting for, the decisive stage of the trap. Karen reached the exact position he had designated for the final step. From his hidden vantage point, he activated the last element. A subtle shift, barely perceptible, that would create the maximum effect without any immediate suspicion. Karen paused, a faint frown crossing her face. Something didn't feel right. Her eyes darted around, searching for the source, but it was too late. The trap was already working. Every element he had placed, every minor adjustment he had made, had led her here. He could feel the tension mounting like a storm about to break. This was the culmination of weeks of patience, planning, and observation. Karen had unknowingly provided him with every piece of the puzzle, and now it was falling perfectly into place. A faint smile spread across his face. Not out of cruelty, but satisfaction. Satisfaction in knowing that patience and intelligence were finally paying off. Karen had underestimated him, and now she was discovering the consequences of that mistake. She took a step back, confused, trying to regain her usual composure. But the subtle effects of the trap guided her movements, pushing her exactly where he had intended. Every stumble, every adjustment, every moment of hesitation was part of the plan. And he watched calmly, knowing it was working better than he had imagined. The tension in the street was almost unbearable. The sun reflected off the leaves of the hedge, glittering in a way that made it seem like the world itself was waiting for the final outcome. Karen had no idea that every single move she had made over the past weeks had been analyzed, recorded, and used against her. And then it happened. The final trigger, a small, almost invisible action, set off the chain reaction. Karen froze, eyes wide in shock, as she realized, too late, that she had walked directly into the consequences of her own actions. He remained hidden, heart steady, watching every reaction. This was the payoff. The culmination of strategy, patience, and precise planning. Karen's smirk, the one she had worn for weeks as she destroyed his hedge, was gone. Replaced by confusion, disbelief, and a dawning understanding that she had underestimated him completely. For a moment, the street was silent. The calm before the inevitable aftermath. And in that silence, he allowed himself a deep breath. Weeks of preparation, observation, and planning had led to this exact moment. And it had worked flawlessly. Karen finally stepped back, looking around, realizing something had changed, but it was too late. The trap had done its job. The execution was complete. Every detail, every subtle cue, every predictable habit she had relied on had been used against her, and the payoff was undeniable. He watched her leave, still processing the unexpected turn of events. His patience had won. His plan had succeeded. And as he stepped out to check the hedge, now a symbol of his persistence rather than her destruction, he knew that the next steps would seal the lesson Karen would never forget. The war had moved from frustration to strategy, and now, the execution had proved that patience and intelligence always outmatch arrogance and recklessness. Karen had finally discovered the cost of messing with someone who was determined, clever, and completely prepared. The street was unusually quiet that morning, almost as if the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. He stepped outside, surveying the scene with a calm precision that only weeks of planning could create. The hedge was intact, the cameras hidden, and every small detail was in its place. But today wasn't about preparation, it was about the final act. Karen's car was parked in her usual spot, shiny and expensive, a symbol of her arrogance. For weeks, she had walked past the hedge, crushing branches, smirking like she was untouchable. Today, she would see exactly how wrong she had been. He moved silently, checking the timing one last time. Every detail mattered. One small misstep could ruin the impact. But he had calculated everything down to the minute. This was the moment when patience, intelligence, and strategy would collide with Karen's arrogance, and the result would be unforgettable. Karen stepped out of her house, coffee in hand, sunglasses shielding her eyes as always. She didn't notice the subtle changes he had made, the small shifts in the environment that would guide her reactions. Her confidence was palpable, she believed she was in control. But control, he knew, was an illusion. And he intended to shatter that illusion completely. He activated the first part of the setup, a minor trigger that caused a subtle movement near her car. At first, it was almost unnoticeable. Karen glanced at it, puzzled, but didn't suspect anything. That was exactly the point. She would react naturally, exactly as he had predicted, stepping directly into the sequence that would reveal the full consequence of her actions. Each small detail he had arranged over weeks came into play now. The hidden cameras captured her reactions, the minor distractions guided her, and her own predictable behavior ensured that everything unfolded perfectly. It was a symphony of cause and effect, and Karen, unknowingly, was the main instrument. She approached her car, still confident, still smirking faintly, and then she noticed it, something was off. A subtle shift, a movement she couldn't explain. Her expression changed from smugness to confusion. Her hands hesitated on the door handle. That pause, that brief moment of uncertainty, was exactly what he had planned for. From his hidden position, he watched every micro-expression, every tiny movement. Karen's confusion grew, her arrogance beginning to crack. And then came the moment he had been waiting for, the full reveal. Her eyes widened as she finally understood. Something she had never imagined possible had happened. The consequences of her daily destruction, the smirks, the bent branches, the arrogance, had culminated in a result she could never have predicted. He stepped out of his hiding place, calm, collected, and satisfied. No shouting, no dramatic confrontation, just the quiet presence of someone who had been patient, clever, and fully prepared. Karen froze, realizing that the person she had underestimated was not only capable of defending themselves but had done so with intelligence and precision. You did all this?" she stammered, disbelief written across her face. He didn't need to answer. The result spoke for itself. The hedge was intact, his yard undisturbed, and her car, a symbol of her arrogance, stood as a silent reminder of her miscalculation. Every detail of her behavior had led to this moment, and she had no one to blame but herself. The satisfaction he felt wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice, about proving that patience and strategy always triumph over carelessness and arrogance. Every day Karen had destroyed the hedge, she had unknowingly built the path to her own realization. And now, the lesson was complete. For a moment, the neighborhood was still. No words were needed. The calm morning, the intact hedge, and the subtle signs of his plan were enough. Karen looked at him, a mixture of shock and begrudging respect in her eyes. He allowed himself a small smile, not out of cruelty, but from the quiet triumph of seeing a plan executed flawlessly. Weeks of observation, planning, and patience had led to this moment. The payback was complete, and the message was clear: arrogance had consequences. Karen finally turned away, still processing the unexpected turn of events. Her usual confidence was shaken, replaced by the realization that she had underestimated someone who had carefully studied her, learned her patterns, and waited for the perfect moment. He stepped back toward the hedge, his heart steady, knowing that the war had ended in his favor. The hedge, once a target of daily frustration, now stood as a symbol of patience, planning, and precise execution. Karen had learned the cost of her actions, and he had proven that cleverness and perseverance always outmatch recklessness and arrogance. The quiet streets slowly returned to normal. But the lesson remained, a subtle, powerful reminder of what happens when someone is underestimated. And as he watered the hedge one last time that morning, he knew that the story wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice, patience, and the quiet power of careful planning. Karen would never forget this day, and the hedge would never again be just a hedge. It had become a symbol of resilience, intelligence, and the ultimate payback. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet street. The neighborhood seemed calm, almost untouched by the drama of the past weeks. But beneath the surface, everything had changed. He stood by the hedge, watching the leaves sway gently in the breeze. To anyone else, it was just a green line of bushes, neatly trimmed. But to him, it was a symbol of patience, strategy, and the lesson Karen had just learned. He thought back to the first day Karen had destroyed the hedge. He remembered the frustration, the disbelief, the countless mornings spent repairing the damage. At the time, it had felt endless, like a small, cruel nightmare. But now, after weeks of careful planning, observation, and execution, the story had come full circle. The hedge had survived, and so had he, stronger, wiser, and more patient than before. Karen, he knew, would never look at the world the same way again. Her arrogance, her smirks, her careless habits, they had all contributed to her own lesson. And while he hadn't needed to confront her loudly or aggressively, the outcome had spoken for itself. Sometimes, he realized, the quietest victories were the most powerful. As he straightened a few bent leaves, he reflected on the process. Revenge, he thought, was more than just a reaction. It was about understanding, planning, and acting with precision. Karen had thought she could intimidate him, disrupt his life, and walk away unscathed. But she had underestimated the power of patience, intelligence, and quiet determination. He smiled faintly to himself. Not from cruelty, but from satisfaction. The satisfaction of knowing that weeks of frustration had led to a resolution that was fair, clever, and unforgettable. He had turned a daily nuisance into a lesson in strategy, showing that actions, even small, careless ones, always have consequences. The neighborhood seemed to notice the change too, even if they didn't understand the details. People walked by, smiling politely, commenting on how peaceful the street looked. But he knew the truth. The calm was not just in the environment, it was in the knowledge that he had taken control of a situation that had once seemed hopeless. He thought about the $27,000 plan, the careful setup, the precise execution, and the final payback. It hadn't been about the money, really, it had been about proving a point. About showing that cleverness, patience, and strategic thinking could triumph over arrogance and recklessness. And as he looked at the hedge, standing intact and proud, he realized that the real victory wasn't material, it was the satisfaction of knowing that justice, in its quietest form, had been served. Karen, he knew, would reflect on the events too. She would remember the hedge, the carefully executed plan, the consequences of underestimating someone. Perhaps she would learn caution, or at least respect for others' boundaries. Maybe, he thought, she would even change slightly. Or maybe not. But the lesson had been delivered, and that was enough. He also realized something about himself. The weeks of observation, planning, and execution had taught him more than he expected. Patience, strategy, and careful attention to detail weren't just tools for revenge, they were skills for life. He had learned how to stay calm under pressure, how to think ahead, and how to act decisively when the moment was right. And those lessons, he knew, would stay with him long after the hedge had grown and the street had returned to its usual quiet rhythm. As evening fell, he stood quietly, watching the shadows stretch across the yard. The air smelled faintly of earth and leaves, a reminder of all the mornings he had spent tending to the hedge, repairing the damage, and preparing for this moment. The street was silent, but in that silence, he felt a sense of closure. The story of Karen and the hedge had started as a simple conflict, a small annoyance in an otherwise peaceful neighborhood. But it had grown into something much bigger, a story of patience, strategy, and the quiet triumph of intelligence over arrogance. And now, as he looked at the intact hedge and the calm street, he knew that the story had reached its natural conclusion. Yet, there was a subtle thrill in the air, a lingering sense that the events of the past weeks had left an invisible mark. Karen had learned her lesson, yes, but the memory of the plan, the patience, and the execution would linger. And for him, that lingering knowledge was part of the quiet satisfaction. He turned to go inside, taking one last look at the hedge. It stood strong, green, and intact, more than just a plant, more than just a piece of his yard. It was a testament to patience, strategy, and the careful planning that had turned frustration into a lesson. And as he closed the door behind him, he whispered softly, almost to himself, sometimes, the quietest victories are the most unforgettable. The neighborhood remained peaceful, the hedge remained standing, and a lesson had been learned, one that would not be forgotten anytime soon. The story was over, but its echoes would remain, a reminder that patience, intelligence, and careful planning could triumph in ways that anger and arrogance never could.